For the text I want to preach on is a very familiar text from John 14, verses 1 to 3. Jesus said, and you don't need to look it up, you can just listen because it's familiar to you. Do not let your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go and prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to be with myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. Familiar text, isn't it? How many of you have heard that scripture read at a funeral or memorial service? Oh, many of you have. How many of you have heard that scripture read at a wedding? So one person has. Could have been a wedding that I had, because when Jesus wanted to prepare his disciples in the upper room after the Last Supper for what was about to happen, how he was going to die and rise again, and he was going to ascend into heaven and be with his Father, and later on he would prepare a place for us and come again and take us to be with himself so that we could be with him forever in heaven. He used the analogy of a first century Jewish wedding. And even the disciples were a little bit amazed when he's talking about heaven. Why is he talking about a wedding? And so what I'd like to do is explain what Jesus was really referring to. For in a first century wedding, these were arranged marriages. Parents of the bride, the parents of the groom, made the arrangements and then brought the couple together. Now, the young man, when he reached the age of about 19 or so, the parents began to look for a prospective bride, because usually the groom would be married at the age of 20, 21 years of age. But the bride they were looking for was normally about 16 to 18 years of age. And when they looked around, when the parents of the groom looked around, very often they, of course, knew about all the young girls that age in their village, but also they had friends and relatives in other villages as well, and they looked at the selection of possibilities, and when they finally said, I think this would be the perfect young lady for our son as a bride, they would go to the prospective bride's parents and discuss it together. And sometimes the other parents said, no, wait, no. But sometimes they'd say, well, this sounds good. Can we get together again and talk about it? And then they would arrange, if it looked promising, they'd arrange for the young man and the young woman to get to know one another. Of course, with the chaperones, the parents there in their presence. They'd never be allowed to meet alone. And in many cases, the young man already knew the young lady because they grew up in the same village. He was 5 years older, but they would have known one another's family. They may have had many opportunities socially to be together. But when the young couple seemed to feel good about it, then the next step was the fathers would negotiate the bridal price or the dowry. And that was very, very important. Because in a first century Jewish marriage, the young man unfortunately had the right, if anything about his wife displeased him after they were married, she burnt the dinner 3 nights in a row, she couldn't have children, he didn't like some of the things that she did or wouldn't do for him, all he had to do is 3 times say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and the marriage was over. He'd send her away. The only thing she could take with her out of that marriage was the dowry. And therefore, it was to the advantage of the bride's father to negotiate the highest bridal price he could get. Because what young man was going to let that wife with that big dowry just walk out of the house? Very interesting, even today, as we visit with nomadic tribes there in the wilderness of Judea. You often see with these nomadic women, they have the dowry in terms of coins, gold and silver coins, actually sewed right into their normal dress, everyday dress, or the jewelry which they wear. It's called a portable prenup. That is to say, if her husband, even today, says, go, you have to leave with just what you're wearing. She's wearing the dowry. You see, so she has something to live on if she's dismissed from the wedding. It was very interesting when I took Ida and I took our son and daughter to Israel when they were in middle school, and our daughter is blonde hair and blue-eyed, a very attractive, charming young girl. And this Arab man came up and said to me, I offer you 15 camels for your daughter for my son. And I listened to him and I said, My daughter was standing right next to me and said, Dad! I said, well, honey, I couldn't quite figure how I could get 15 camels back on El Al's airplane. But that custom of, is still part of that culture. She knew later that I was just kidding. And she still laughs at that story now. But once the dowry is agreed upon, the fathers shake hands. And then comes the engagement. Mother and father of the bride and groom-to-be gather together. There could be some other people there. And the father of the groom gives to his son a goblet of wine. And he takes this and says to the bride-to-be, this is my life, which I give to you, because blood is considered, or wine is considered to be representing blood, which is life. This is my life which I offer to you. Will you be my wife? And he hands her the cup. I learned that she could say, no. And she had that option. I didn't think there was an option, but she could say no. And her parents would say, honey, I hope you know what you're doing. Because this is, we think, the best option available. But she could say no. But if she says yes, she then takes it from him and drinks from the cup and says, yes, I will be yours, and I give my life to you. Now they are officially engaged. Okay? But there's no wedding date set. And there's a very, very good reason why they don't set the wedding. The wedding date is set when the young man goes back to his father's house and builds right adjoining it a separate dwelling for he and his wife to be. And only when his father agrees that that dwelling that he's building for his new bride is adequate for his future daughter-in-law, only then can he say, okay, the wedding is going to be in 5 days. And you say, having a 5-day notice about a wedding, that's not enough time. Oh, yes it is, because you see, people are watching the building of that house. And if that young man is a skilled carpenter, and especially if he has friends to help him, and if he's really in love, he can build that house as fast as he can. Or if he's wealthy, he can hire people to help build the house. But if he's lazy, it may seem to take forever. But people are watching. They know the wedding date by watching the construction of the house. So they have all that time, to get their wedding gifts ready, to get the proper wedding garments, and if it's a poor family that can't afford it, they can say to the groom's father, can you loan me a wedding garment so I can come appropriately to the wedding? And the bridesmaids, they get their dresses, they get their lamps, and they get all their oil, they get everything ready ahead of time, and then they know 5 days from now, it's on. Then comes the wedding. Where is it? It's in the courtyard in front of the father's house, with the son building his dwelling house for his bride right next door. And they have the canopy. You've seen the canopy. And then they break the goblet and the wedding. Then the bride and groom go into the dwelling place. They consummate the intimacy of marriage. They come out. And for up to a week, there's dancing and feasting and celebration. And the whole, all the wedding guests spend this long time together rejoicing in the beginning of a new marriage together. Now, what's very interesting is there are so many parables that Jesus teaches, or so many events in the New Testament that go back to that wedding custom. For example, you remember the first miracle that Jesus did. It was at a wedding. And this was a wedding in Cana, which I've been to Cana, I've been to Nazareth, and it's a long day's trip by foot from Nazareth to Cana. But apparently Mary and Joseph and the family were known by the family there in Cana, and they said, Mary, Joseph had already died by this time. Mary, will you and Jesus and Jesus' disciples, you all come to the wedding? And so they came to the wedding. And I suspect, sort of humorously, that the groom's father didn't realize how many disciples Jesus had. So they ran out of food and especially wine. Now, if you know anything about the Middle East, the most embarrassing thing you can be as a host is to run out of food. It's considered a cardinal sin. And they ran out of wine. And you know the story. Mary said, just ask my son. And he turned the water into wine. And the steward of the feast said, my, this is amazing. Usually you put your best wine out first, and when people are thoroughly drunk, then you bring out the cheapest wine. The $2 chuck. But you have saved the best wine for last. And then remember the parable of the man who was invited to the wedding feast, and one man said, I cannot come to the wedding. I have just purchased a cow, and I have to go look at it. I just purchased a field, and I have to go examine it. I have just married my wife, and I have to, all these excuses. And in that parable, Jesus said there are many people who will use an excuse to the Father why they can't show up and be ready when God calls them home. And that the host knew that these excuses were excuses. You don't buy a field without first looking at it. Because you don't know whether it's just a barren field that's going to take years to terrace so you can plant crops, or whether it's already terraced. You look at it first. You don't buy a house sight unseen. You look at it first. You don't buy a cow and then say, oh, by the way, now that I bought it, let me see what it looks like. No. So these are excuses. And then remember the man who said, I don't have the proper wedding garment, but shorts and flip-flops and a T-shirt. I mean, who cares? So he comes into and the host said, why are you not wearing your wedding garment? Well, I didn't know where I could find one. You never asked me. You see, the host would always provide. And people say, well, when it comes to death, are you ready? Well, I think I'm ready. I mean, I've been a good person and so forth. And Jesus might say, where is the robe of righteousness, the robe of salvation that I provided for you? You never asked me. You never trusted me. You see, he uses all those analogies of a wedding. And then finally, it says in 2 Corinthians, Paul said, we are the bride of Christ, and Christ is the groom. And when we get to heaven, the first thing we're going to do is celebrate the wedding feast of the groom with all of his forever family. Isn't it amazing? All those teachings built around a wedding. Well, what I want to do is to remind us as we come to the Lord's table that we cannot come to the Lord's table on our own and say, well, I've lived a good life. I'm a good person. I've been active in church. I put some money in the offering plate. I think God will let me into heaven. No, Jesus said, you cannot earn your way into salvation. It's a gift that I give you. You need to be forgiven and be given the robe of righteousness which I can give you. And then you are welcome to the wedding feast of the Lamb. It's because of what he did for us, not because of what we do for him. That gives us the opportunity of being part of that great celebration in the Father's house that Jesus has prepared for us all.